We're jumping back into our teaching series that we began last week. And really over the next 5, 6, or 7 weeks, we are looking at what it means to be fully alive. What does it mean for us to be fully alive in 2025? Saint Irenaeus, a bishop in the church in the AD 100s, he famously said this: "The glory of God is man fully alive." That our aliveness, our sense of fullness of life, and God's glory are somehow tied together. God's happiness and our happiness are somehow linked. Me being fully alive as a person is something that God is committed to. That our lives and God's glory are bound together. And you remember Jesus echoes these words in John 10:10, where he says the thief, meaning the devil or Satan, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. But he says, I've come that they, meaning us and all believers, I've come that they may have life and have it to the full. And last week, if you were here, we kind of laid the foundation for this, that we as people, the people of God, are meant to be people who experience life and life in its fullest sense. Now, that doesn't mean, and we went to great labours to explain this last week, that doesn't mean a problem-free life. But it means that we learn to do life well in the midst of challenge, in the midst of pain. And as we discovered last week, our fullness of life is lived out in the midst of blessings and battles. It's in the moments, the high times and the low times. And that life isn't so much a succession of, oh, I'm in a good season, I'm going to have a bad season, it's a good season, I'm going to have a bad season. Life isn't like that. Actually, life is like a train track. And actually, on one side of the track, we can experience goodness. And on the other side of the track, right at the same time, things can be difficult. We have battles to face. And if you remember, we used this metaphor of a car dashboard. And we said, look, one of the ways that we learn to wrestle with the good and bad of life, one of the ways that we learn to do life well is learning to read the gauges on the dashboard of our life. And we began to think about some of the different gauges, the different dials on the dashboard, and how they might be doing. How's our spiritual gauge? How's our emotional gauge? How's our physical gauge? Are we running on empty? Are the lights flashing? Are there some warnings that we need to fill up our tanks? We need some resources to fill up our tanks. We also said last week that living life in its fullest sense is ultimately living a life rooted in following Jesus, apprenticing ourselves to Jesus. And we said we do that in 3 distinct ways. We do that in an upward motion. We do that in an upward direction. That upward direction represents our connection to God. That first and foremost, we're called to be people who are connected to Him, who are tied to Him, who are related to Him. We also said we get to become more like Jesus as we live in this inward direction. And that's all about the kind of people that you and I are becoming. It's about the character that's developing within us. And primarily, our character gets lived out, gets fleshed out in the context of community. And so we're learning to reach in terms of our own internal lives. We're reaching in together. We're doing that together in the context of a community. And then we talked a little bit about that. There's an outward direction to our lives as well. It's about our calling to reach out to the world around us, to see God's mission lived out in our world, to see his kingdom come in the places that we inhabit. And so becoming fully alive means becoming more like Jesus. It means doing life the way he did life. And that's really what this whole series is about, that as followers of Jesus, we are to be transformed. Transformed, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians, from glory to glory. That the life of Jesus is to dominate you. We are to be taken over by him. We're to be possessed by Jesus, to become more like him. That this life, so often as Christians, we have this story that frames our Christian existence about preparing us for death. Sounds quite morbid, doesn't it? But a lot of the presentations of the gospel are presentations, oh, I'm going to prepare you to die. Because, you get to go to heaven when you die. But actually, Jesus talks about life, that he came to give us life. And so we want Jesus' life to dominate who we are. And so I want to ask us a rhetorical question this morning to kind of frame what we're going to do. And it's this: what's your plan to become more like Jesus? What's your plan? What steps are you taking to become more like him? Maybe you've never considered that question. Maybe you're thinking, well, I'm here, aren't I? I'm in this place. And that's a great start. Gathering in places like this is a good thing to do. It's a good starting point. But it's possible to gather in places like this, but for us to still not automatically become more like Jesus. And if you've been around church for any length of time, you will know this is true. Truth be told, for some people, the more they're around church, the worse they become. We all know that to be true, don't we? We've all met people like that. If you haven't, let me tell you something. If you haven't, don't look at the person next to you. But we all seen the reality of that. It seems that some people, church makes them worse than better. And, there is a world around us who think church people, they get together for an hour and a half each week and all they do is suck on lemons. Because that's kind of what their faces look like. And you're thinking, does it? And I'm like, yeah, it does. Because somehow just coming here with... can actually, sometimes people just coming here doesn't mean they're any more alive. They're increasingly perhaps even more miserable, increasingly more judgmental. Just turning up here doesn't fix that. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And you see, it's possible to be part of something and not enter into the life that it brings. Not enter into the difference it's meant to make. You can show up here on a Sunday and just be a spectator. Just kind of stand on the sidelines. Now, if I said to you in 6 months' time, you're going to compete in a triathlon. Okay, you're gonna compete in a triathlon. If that's the case, my guess is you're going to have to make a plan, okay? Because if you don't have a plan, it's not going to go well. You can't just decide, I'm going to compete in a triathlon, And you can't just decide to say, from now on, refer to me as a triathlete. It doesn't work. Just saying you will do a triathlon and referring yourself as a triathlete doesn't mean a thing unless you make a plan and train yourself to do it. And in the same way, we have to intentionally learn to train ourselves to become more like Jesus. Even though his grace is given to us freely, we can't earn his grace. It's a free gift. Grace is opposed to earning, Dallas Willard says, but it's not opposed to our effort. We still have to do something. We still have to train. You see, it's possible to put ourselves in the right environments, to call ourselves the right things, and have the very best of intentions, yes, yet totally miss the life that's on offer. The opportunity to be fully alive, to live a life that's dominated, a life that's possessed, that's being transformed by Jesus. And so what's your plan to become more like Jesus? Well, in the time we've got this morning, I want us to think about what might be a starting point in beginning to even answer a question like that. And I think we do that by learning to address a particular battle that each one of us has. And that's a battle for our mind. You see, our minds, the way we think, is the starting point of all life. What I believe is what it means to be fully alive and to live a transformed life starts in the place of how we think, how our minds think and ponder and shape the life that we live. If you've got a Bible, why don't you turn to Romans chapter 12. We're just going to be in the first couple of verses there. And so it says, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices. In other words, because of God's grace, because of God's mercy, because of his love that is lavished upon us, because of everything God has done for you, offer yourself back to him. That's what Paul's saying. He says, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. And in verse 2, he says, do not conform to the pattern of this world. In other words, don't just eat what the world eats. Don't just say what the world says. Don't just work the way the world works. Don't just bring your kids up like all the other people bring up their kids. Don't just be married like everyone else is married. Don't just conform. Because God's grace has invaded your being, because our lives are being transformed, because we know he loves us, because we know we're part of a much bigger story than the story that we started in, don't conform. Don't just conform to how everyone else is doing it. Instead, Paul says, be transformed. Be transformed. How? By the renewing of your mind. You see, it starts in our mind. A life of transformation, a life fully alive, it starts with how you and I think. Paul says, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. His good and pleasing and perfect will. Have any of us ever wondered what God's will is? What his will is? We can't we, be guilty of just living our lives, doing what we do, and simply asking God to bless it. And we kind of come to God and we're like, Lord, just bless the mess. Just bless the mess of my life. But there's another way to live, and that's to say, God, I want you to invade my mind, to restructure my mind, to change the pattern of my thinking. God, I want your mind. I want to think like you think. Now, the mind is a powerful thing, isn't it? The way we use our mind, it's like a powerful muscle. How many of us have watched a movie or a TV show and it's caused an emotional response in us? It's caused us to respond emotionally. Maybe you've watched a movie and it's made you cry. All the guys are like going. You've watched something and it's made you cry. Maybe you've watched something and it's made you laugh or feel angry or scared. Maybe you felt pain watching a movie. Tammy and I were watching the new Sky. What was it? It's just like the show about Lockerbie, the Lockerbie disaster, and that was like harrowing. And it conjures up all these kinds of emotions and a sense of pain. How many of us have felt the pain of love watching a movie? Particularly in the sort of late 1990s, early noughties, when you watch films that had lines like, I'm just a girl standing in front of a boy, asking him to love her. Or what about this one? You complete me. Or you had me at a low. We've all felt the realities of that, haven't we? And it kind of shows what I'm forced to watch at home. But when you analyze that, all movies all TV shows are lights that flicker on a screen. It's fake. It's not real. Yet it has an ability to influence our mind. It has an ability to influence what we think and therefore what we feel and how we emotionally respond. You see, our minds are so powerful that when they're invaded with images and ideas, it causes our hearts and bodies to respond. And you see, God gives us the ability to control our minds. Because where we put our minds will ultimately shape the kinds of people we become. You see, often we want God to change our circumstances, don't we? Change our jobs, change our marriages, change our kids, change our friends. Yet time and time again, throughout the scriptures, God leads his people to change their mind, to change their thinking before he changes their circumstances. We touched on this last week that, he changes us in the midst of our pain and suffering. He changes what's going on inside of us before he changes the circumstances around us. And so as we think about taking control of our minds, I think there are two areas that we need to look to. Two things that God gives us grace for. The first thing is what we do with what we believe about ourselves. What we do with what we believe about ourselves. You see, what we believe about ourselves shapes our behavior. If I was to say to you, make a list of 10 things you believe about yourself, my guess is, and you might want to do this exercise this afternoon, but my guess is some of those things that you would list would be fairly negative. And if we were to press a little bit deeper into that list, I could almost guarantee most of those 10 things are things, negative things that someone else has said to you, most likely when you were a child. Things that were said to you as a child. You see, when you were a child, maybe someone said, you're just not that clever. Or you're a bit clumsy. Or you're not that good looking, or you're irresponsible. You don't follow through on your commitments. You see, the words of others said to us in those formational moments in our lives often shape what we think about ourselves. Other things on our list will be the things that we say to ourselves. Just because of our own state of emotional well-being. Things like, no one's there for me. Everyone lets me down. Everyone hates me. I can't count on anyone. And you see, all those sorts of things are like seeds that are planted. And as a result, they form who we choose to be. Who we choose to be in our relationships, who we choose to be in our marriages, how we manage those relational connections with other people. It often shapes the jobs we do. It often shapes how we choose to do life. Now, some of us may have some positive things on the list, I'm sure. Some of you were perhaps told you were clever, were perhaps told that you were kind, caring, whatever it might be. But positive or negative, they can all be completely untrue. And yet our minds will take those things and believe them to be true regardless. And that will shape the kind of person we become. It will shape the kind of person we are. Those of us who are married may have experienced this. Have you ever been talking to your spouse and you're having a conversation and you realize in their responses that you're having a conversation with them that they've had multiple times for years and years gone by? You know, that there's baggage there. And I don't know if you can imagine that. But imagine that if you're a husband, imagine that your wife says to you, hey, the bin men are coming today, would you mind putting out the rubbish? And you're like, sure, no problem. The only problem is that you forget. You forget to do that. And then you get home that evening and your wife says, oh, you didn't put out the rubbish like I asked you to. And that's all she says. But what you hear is, you lazy, good-for-nothing child. You never do anything I ask you to do. You cannot be trusted with anything. That's what you hear, and that's how you respond. But all she said was, you were going to put the rubbish out, and you didn't. And yet, because of the seeds, because of the junk that's been planted in your life, we hear something completely different. And we're all guilty of that, aren't we? We're all guilty of those kinds of moments. There are things, we're all guilty of thinking what people say or what they imply. And we're all guilty of responding in extreme ways simply because of the negativeness that has been planted in our hearts. And it takes an acknowledgement of that on our behalf to begin to change the way we posture ourselves in moments like that. And that's rooted in the way we think. And we all have to choose to do that. We all have to choose to respond differently, don't we, in those kinds of situations. Because we can't be controlled by or dictated to by the things that have been said to us in the past. The other thing that we need to take control of is what we believe about God. So we have to take control of what we believe about ourselves, but we also have to take control of what we believe about God. A.W. Tozer said, "What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us." And so not only do we project what we think about ourselves onto God, but usually what happens is that whatever we think about our earthly fathers is what we think about our heavenly Father. And so when we think about God, what comes to mind? Well, there is a danger that if you had a passive earthly father, that somehow we can project that onto God. That he's not really interested in me. He doesn't want to know the details. He'd rather sleep or would rather go and do his own thing. He's not interested in what I have to say. Or maybe you had a father who was angry. And so you see God as angry, ready to tell you off, scold you, to punish you because he thinks you're stupid. Maybe you think, I irritate God like I irritated my dad. Whatever it might be. And not only do we project how other people have treated us onto God, we also project our own stuff onto God as well. Not just the stuff from our past, but the stuff from our present. Often those things that will distract us from him and hinder us. And what we do is we make those things okay in our minds, and therefore we create a God in our own image who is okay with everything that we do. You see, all these ways of thinking shape the kinds of people we become. But here's something that interesting that Jesus said in John 14:9. He says, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." Jesus says, if you've seen what I'm like, you know what God the Father's like. You know, and if we were to see Jesus with a fresh set of eyes and see the love and compassion and the mercy that flows from who he is, if we were to see Jesus, really see Jesus, how would that change things? How would that change the way we think? If we was to really understand right now that we are completely loved, that there was nothing you could do to make him love you less, and there was nothing you could do to make him love you more. You're completely loved. That he's the one pursuing you. That he's always moving towards you in love and forgiveness. That he suffered on your behalf, and yet he has power to overcome. When we see these things, they have an ability to reshape the way we think. And so we begin to see ourselves differently, and we see God differently, and it changes us. It changes us, and it changes the kind of life we live. Maybe it means we have a life that feels fully alive. But how do we choose to do that? How do we begin to do that? And so I just want to offer 3 ways that I think we can redirect our minds, and then we're going to pray. So 3 ways we can redirect our minds. First of all, feed your minds with truth. Matthew 4:4, it says, people need more than bread for their life. They must feed on every word of God. You see, when we look to truth, it pushes out lies. And so we need to fill our heads with what is right and true and helpful. You know, our minds are like big open buckets, and they will get filled up. There are tons of things, aren't there, vying for our attention. And the challenge is, will we let our minds be filled in an active way or in a passive way? It's often said we know what controls a culture by the music it listens to and by the predominant themes that culture worships and ascribes to. And so what is the music on the radio? What is the images that we see in advertising, on TV? Well, there's a lot of, how do I say this? There's a lot of sex. There's a lot of overly sexualized imagery. And there's a good reason for that. Sex sells, doesn't it? Sex sells, and it has an ability to engage people. Sex sells shampoo to women, it sells deodorant to men. And there is this false sense within that, of this sense of what romanticism really looks like. That unless you've got some Puerto Rico guy stroking your hair, then life isn't worth living. You know, and you imagine that, and then you look to your side, and there's your respective other half sort of dusting off the Dorito dust, you know. And suddenly a Puerto Rico sounds more appealing. But sex sells, doesn't it? And that's the predominant noise. That's the predominant imagery of our culture. And then we wonder why marriages fall apart. Why husbands and wives don't know how to relate. Because they fill their minds with stuff that isn't real. It's not true. So we feed our minds with truth. Secondly, we feed your mind, free your mind from deceptive thoughts. Romans 8:5, those who are dominated by the sinful nature think about sinful things, but those who are controlled by the Holy Spirit think about things that please the Spirit. Do you know your top 5 destructive thoughts? You know, those things that you kind of turn to by default when you're at your weakest moment, physically, emotionally. Lies you tell yourself. Maybe things like you're a loser. You're good for nothing. You know, lies that you whispered in your ear, like, no one loves me. I'm never going to make it. They're all destructive ways of thinking that we all retreat to in moments of pain, in moments where we feel emotionally depleted. And you see, our task is to learn to dwell on new thoughts and to replace those destructive ones. It's exactly what Jesus did in the wilderness, isn't it? You know, when the devil spoke to him, spoke untruths to him, Jesus responded by quoting the scripture back to him and saying, no, it's written like this. You know, if ever there was a good reason for us to memorize portions of scripture, it's in those moments, isn't it? It's in those moments when we're telling ourselves lies about who we are, when we're not really kind of living in our true identity. And then lastly, we need to focus your mind on the right things. Hebrews 12:3 says, think about Jesus' example. He held on whilst wicked people were doing evil things to him. So do not get tired and stop trying. And so our task is to learn to focus on Jesus, to fill our minds with him. Focus on what's good, true, trustworthy, noble. Things that Paul talks about in Philippians 4. We haven't got time to turn there. And when we focus on Jesus, we remember the fact that God came for us. He gave everything for us. He came and he gave his life so that you and I may have life. And can you imagine how different life might be if we knew that to be true? That we were loved perfectly every single day. That we don't have to be insecure. We don't have to perform. That we don't have to impress anyone. That we can just relax in his grace and mercy. Just think about how different life would be, how different your marriage might be, how different your job might be, if you could address the reality of that in your mind. Could you possibly start to change in the process? When we look at our lives, the scriptures talk about that we reap what we sow. And if you sow a thought, it reaps an action. And if we sow an action, it reaps a habit. And if we sow a habit, it forms our character. And so what thoughts and beliefs are we sowing? What thoughts and beliefs are shaping the kinds of people we are becoming? Now, could you imagine what would happen if a room like this one was full of people who just made a choice to dwell their minds and their thoughts on the grace and love and purposes of God? Full of people who made a choice to renew their minds, not conform to the old pattern of things. Do you think things might change? As we change as individuals, maybe that would spill out into our city, into our work environments, into the places that we inhabit. But we have to remember this is a battle. It's a battle for our minds. How many of us show up in a place like this, show up with an expressed intention to worship? And, we stand here, don't we? The words are on the screen. I'm here to worship God. And in the midst of worshiping God, you think the most vilest things in your head. Anybody willing to admit to that? Things go on in your mind and you think, why am I thinking that? I'm here to worship God. That's a battle. That's a battle. That's a battle for our minds. How many of us are hearing what I'm saying right now, but thinking, come on, Steve, it's nearly lunchtime. It's nearly lunch. That's the battle. That's the battle that we face. It's a very real battle that's prevalent right now as I'm speaking. And so as we lean into this whole theme of being fully alive in 2025, as we think about this idea that the glory of God is me being a fully alive person, then we have to start by making some choices about how we think, how our minds are shaped, how our minds shape the way we think about ourselves, the way we think about God. And we need to learn to train ourselves, don't we? Going back to the beginning, our early analogy, we need to train ourselves to think differently,